The first story. Almost immediately after I discovered the mirror, I had the sensation that, incorrect, located in the rear room of an antique shop that I had not intended to explore. It was propped up against a wall that had a fracture in it. After being forced inside by the rain, I was greeted by the aroma of rotting wood and memories that I had long since forgotten. It would have been impossible to tuck away the mirror like an afterthought, because it was so enormous and intricately carved from dark wood that it was framed with twisting vines. The surface was of perfect quality. There are no smudges, there is no dust. Unlike everything else in the vicinity, it appeared to be almost too clean, as if it had not aged a single day. I noticed that I was staring at the shopkeeper, who was an elderly woman with eyes that were too sharp for her weak form. She remarked, "You sure do have a good eye." "It's a piece for the ages." "Who or what was the source of it?" I inquired. She was hesitant. "Sale of estate property. The house was found guilty. Everyone in the family disappeared without a trace." I was intrigued to it despite the fact that it had a sinister beginning, required to do so. Despite the nagging feeling of worry that was nagging at the back of my mind, I went ahead and made the purchase. At my residence, I positioned it in the corridor. Because of this, the room appeared larger and brighter. Every day for a while, I was in awe of it. That is, until I became aware that the reflection was not entirely correct. It began in a soft manner. When I would go by, I would notice that there was a little delay, just a fraction of a second, between my movement and the feedback from the mirror. I attributed it to the brightness, my exhaustion, and my imagination. On the other hand, I witnessed something late one night that completely dispelled that notion. Around 3 in the morning, I got up to get some water, and on my way to the kitchen, I walked by the mirror. It was in the faint light of the hallway light that I noticed my reflection standing still and looking back at me through the mirror. I became numb. On reflection, I did not appear to be holding a glass. I was not in the middle of a step. Just now, I was. While I was standing there, my eyes were fixed on mine, and a half smile was curving up on my lips. But my face was not smiling. As I dropped the glass, my heart was thumping like crazy, and it shattered on the floor. I turned around, anticipating that there was something or someone behind me. None of it. As soon as I turned round, my reflection mirrored my state of panic. The synchronization is perfect once more. I attempted to persuade myself that it was a dream caused by stress. I had not gotten enough sleep, overworked and exhausted. However, following that, I avoided touching the mirror. In order to convince myself that I would sell it, I covered it with a sheet, give it away, any means necessary to remove it from my house. But the lid did not remain in place. When I woke up in the morning, I would discover the sheet folded nicely on the floor. The feeling that someone or something was trying to remind me that it was still present. The temperature in the hallway dropped. As I walked by, the lights began to flicker. It was then that the mirror started revealing things that were not there in my flat, such as a figure that was just out of frame and shadows that moved independently of the light. It started to appear in my dreams, corridors that are dark, reflections that never end. My doppelganger was standing behind me, looking through 1,000 panes of glass and speaking things that I was unable to comprehend, but could feel in my bones. In the middle of the night, I worked up the nerve to move it. I covered it with blankets and then carried it out to the dumpster that was located behind my building. Unable to sleep that night, my nerves were jangling as I waited for some indication that it had finally disappeared. When I woke up the following morning, I discovered it in the hallway. There are no locks that are broken. There were no indications of a forced entrance. It is only the mirror. We are waiting. Because of that, I began to notice it even when I was not in close proximity to it. The reflections in the windows, in the puddles, and on the screen of my phone are always a little bit off. I was always smiling, even when I wasn't. I am constantly keeping watch. My phone rang at the antique shop. There was a disconnect with the number. After that, I went back to the spot. The store had closed down. Does not close, it's gone, covered in bricks as if it had never been there before. A state of desperation emerged. A local paranormal investigator by the name of Daniel was the one I got in touch with. When he initially saw it, he had a great deal of skepticism. He was adamant about not touching it. He said that it possessed a vitality that he hadn't experienced in many years. Under his breath he murmured, "It's not just haunted, it is firmly rooted. Internally there is a living being, and at this point it is attached to you." He proposed performing an exorcism, practices that purify someone. Anything was acceptable to me. Osat lines, prayers, fire and chanting were all conducted by us as a group during the rite. It was successful for a brief period of time. It was a jagged fracture that split my reflection in half, and the mirror had a crack running down the middle of it. I am still able to see it, in the nooks, at the screens. When one is dreaming, I am the other person. With a smile, we are waiting. Story 2. I had always been drawn by the appeal of solitude, which was the promise of a weekend free from the unrelenting speed of daily life while I was away from the city. The fact that I happened to come across an advertisement for a remote island hideaway seemed like a stroke of luck. It was impossible to resist the concept of being enveloped in the peaceful embrace of nature and having nothing else around you. In a frenzy of enthusiasm, I made the necessary preparations, daydreaming about a tranquil vacation in the middle of the breathtaking natural splendor of an unspoiled paradise. With an optimistic and daring spirit, I set off on my voyage beneath the clear blue sky. During the time that I was navigating the rented boat toward my temporary shelter, the mainland in the distance became less visible. The island, which was a verdant expanse of nature, appeared out of the azure depths as if it were a mirage, and its borders whispered promises of serenity and rebirth along the way. As soon as I arrived, the reality was even better than I had anticipated. The atmosphere was more scented, the silence was profound, and the landscape was a colorful tapestry of life that had not been touched by human hands. Exactly as I had imagined, I experienced the sensation of being completely removed from everything and everyone. The first day was filled with astonishment and curiosity, and it went by in a blur. In spite of the fact that the island was tiny enough to be traversed on foot, each turn revealed wonders, such as a secluded cove here and a dense forest of ancient trees there, each of which had its own set of mysteries under wraps. As the sun began to drop, I made my way into the humble cabin that would eventually become my home. The natural splendor that existed outside was perfectly complemented by the rustic charm that it possessed. The noises of the island at night, which included a symphony of distant waves, rustling foliage, and the occasional cry of a nocturnal creature, served as a calming lullaby that helped me fall into a restful sleep. On the other hand, the happiness was broken the following morning. I awoke to discover that the boat, which was my gateway to the outer world, was banished. When I initially read about the incident, I was completely confused. I got to the shore as quickly as I could, hoping that it was an error and that I had somehow failed to notice it. The reality, however, could not be denied. It is possible that I had made a careless mistake, or that the tides had been playing a humorous, mischievous game and caused the boat to drift away. As I looked out over the horizon, I began to feel terrified. There was no trace of anything. All that was visible was the boundless expanse of the ocean. The concept of isolation took on a new, more ominous connotation. I found myself completely isolated, imprisoned on this island paradise that had become more of a jail than a paradise. I was embarrassed by the paucity of my supplies, which were supposed to last me through the weekend. The awareness that no one knew my precise whereabouts was even more pressing than the last one. The fact that I had forgotten to reveal the particulars of my retreat, which I had done in my pursuit of isolation, was a decision that now tormented me. The days began to become a never-ending loop of surviving and feeling hopeless. The island, which was once a place of tranquility and beauty, has evolved into a huge expanse of difficulties. These two things became my obsession: food and clean water. Through the use of hazy recollections of survival programs and articles, I went out into the wilderness in search of edible plants and fruits. It was a precious commodity that was rationed with great care, and rainwater was collected in containers that were made of improvised materials. Every day, once the sun went down, the noises of the island underwent a transformation. A place that I had formerly considered to be tranquil now gave me the impression that there were hidden dangers waiting just beyond the reach of the firelight. With every rustle in the underbrush and every snap of a twig, my pulse was pounding with excitement. There was a real sense of being watched, of not being alone, that was present in the darkness. My imagination, which was driven by feelings of solitude and terror, brought me images of eyes that glinted in the night, eyes that were predatory, and creatures that were lured to the lone human invader that was in their midst. Over the course of the days, time began to lose its structure. My schedule consisted of accomplishing the fundamental tasks, such as locating food and water and maintaining a fire. I was thankful for the limited knowledge of survival that I had acquired over the years, and I used pebbles and sticks to manufacture tools. Nevertheless, the seclusion that had fascinated me in the past now pressed down on me, like a burden on my chest. Nights were the most challenging. Not only was the silence no longer peaceful, but it was also suffocating. Suddenly, I started to hear sounds, such as rustling in the breeze and rustling in the shadows. Despite the fact that logic told me it was simply animals or my frayed nerves, the sensation of being watched never became less intense. It was heavy and impossible to escape, and it stuck to me like humidity. I had trouble falling asleep, and when I did, I frequently awoke to the sound of something just outside the hut. It was the sound of footfall that were too small to be those of an animal and too deliberate to be imagined. On the other hand, each time I kicked open the door, there was nothing there. Just darkness and a lack of sound. I was dizzy from hunger and tiredness on the 6th day, and I ventured deeper into the interior of the island. I was eager for a distraction, anything to avoid the growing fear that I was not alone. At that moment, I discovered it. It is an old building that has been completely obliterated by the vegetation. It appeared to be a shrine possibly constructed by earlier visitors or residents who had long since left the area. I was unable to comprehend the symbols that were engraved onto the weathered stone. The surrounding woodland was completely silent, not in a natural way. A combination of anxiety and fascination compelled me to move closer to the object. The atmosphere became more dense. Electricity. After that, I did hear it. Breathing. This is not my own. Approaching my ear at a slow and steady pace. My heart was pounding strongly in my chest as I turned around, but there was no one there. None of it. Not even a single sound. Once more, the jungle had resumed its silence, as if it were holding its breath. I made a dash. As I stumbled through the underbrush and made my way back toward the cabin, branches scratched at my skin and caused me to lose my balance. When I finally came to a stop, I was hunched in a corner, shaking and hiding behind a door that was shut. I was not aware of what I had witnessed or how I had felt, but I was aware that I had entered a location that I was not supposed to be in. There was no sleep for me that night. However, redemption appeared in the wee hours of the morning. It was unexpected. As the blades of the chopper made their repetitive beat, the air was agitated. I exploded out of the cottage, throwing my arms wildly and screaming till my throat literally burned. I had been located by a search and rescue team, which had been dispatched after I had failed to return, causing my emergency contact to get anxious. They told me that I was fortunate to be alive. I wasn't really certain about it. The island continues to torment me even now that I am back in the comfort of my own house. Not only the feeling of being alone, the hunger or the terror, but also the presence itself. That kiss on the back of my neck, having the sensation that someone or something had been observing me, looking inside me. We are waiting. Unspoiled as the island's current state, unusual occurrences have not been reported by anyone else. No holy place. The trees are not allowed to breathe. On the other hand, I am aware that what I went through was genuine. In addition, there are moments when I hear it once more, late at night, when the wind is exactly right. It is a gentle breath, a whisper, coming from behind me. I question whether or not I ever actually left that island in the first place. Story 3. Ever since the Wilsons left, the house next door has been standing as a silent sentinel, with its windows acting as if they were black eyes that were keeping watch. The garden, which had been a colourful tapestry in the past, had no longer been able to resist the unrelenting embrace of weeds. It wasn't simply vacant, it had a sense of abandonment, as if even the memories that were contained within its walls had left. The only people who came to visit were the occasional curious cat or the wind, who whispered mysteries to an audience consisting of peeling paint and creaking shutters. This went on for several months. My entire life, I have been a sensible person who seeks comfort in things that are physical and can be explained. Nevertheless, the strange noises that eventually began to puncture the calm of the night from that house that was vacant put my grasp on reality to the test. It began deceptively, almost in a contemptuous manner. There is a faint shuffling sound, similar to the delicate footsteps of someone who is walking slowly in order to avoid being discovered. After some convincing, I came to the conclusion that it was the house settling in, or even animals making themselves at home. After then, however, the sounds changed, grew more courageous. The sound of footsteps, frequently followed by a gentle thud, gave the impression that something was being moved around. Curiosity is a peculiar kind of feeling. In spite of the fact that every ounce of your existence is screaming in protest, it nudges you toward the brink, whispering promises of revelation. My curiosity got the better of me on a night when the moon was hanging low, bathing the world in an ethereal glow. I was curious about what was going on. Suddenly I found myself standing on the edge of my property, staring at the house next door, which appeared to be a dark blot against the night sky thanks to its shadow. The choice to conduct an investigation was made with a heart that was already shaking. I felt as though the beam of light was more of a fragile protection against the unknown, so I armed myself with nothing but a flashlight. As I got closer, the door, which was slightly ajar, seemed to be inviting me to enter the darkness that was inside. It was a mixture of dust and the faint, unsettling odor of decay that permeated the air, and it was dense with the fragrance of dissolution. A living room that appeared to have been trapped in time was revealed by my flashlight as it sliced through the darkness inside. The beam of light caused dust particles to dance, and for a brief period the house had the sensation of being any other house, abandoned but unthreatening. Then, however, my light landed upon indications of recent habitation, such as a makeshift cot in the corner, a few cans of food, and, most chillingly, a pair of eyes reflecting the light back at me from the shadows. As those eyes disappeared into the shadows, I froze, my heart pounding violently in my chest. Suddenly the silence was oppressive. It was thick with the presence of something that was not seen. Every logical explanation fell apart, and I was left with the horrifying thought that I was not the only one experiencing this experience. Having escaped in a state of panic, I could hear the mocking sounds of my own footsteps echoing behind me. Following my exit from the building, I continued to run until I reached the safety of my own residence, at which point I locked the door behind me with trembling hands. It sent shivers down my spine to consider the possibility that I had been unintentionally observed from such a near proximity to my home. On that particular night, I remained awake and listened to the sounds coming from the house next door, which are now indisputable in their significance. Someone, or something, seemed to be residing in that location, an observer of my existence who remains mute. The concept was unpleasant, but the question of what they desired was far more unsettling than the thought itself. I was overcome with compassion, despite the fact that I had first been afraid. Clearly, the man in front of me was in a state of anguish. It was possible that he was more of a victim of circumstance than a threat. In an effort to maintain as much composure as possible, I lowered my flashlight, which helped to reduce the intensity of its brightness. "All is well with you here. No one is going to hurt you," I repeated, not sure whether I was trying to convince him or myself more. No one is going to harm you. It appeared as though he was anticipating the appearance of an unseen threat from the shadows as his eyes darted about the room. As I attempted to pry his story out of him, a complex web of sorrow and anxiety began to take shape. Marcus was the name of the man who, at one point in his life, led a life that was not all that dissimilar to mine. However, he claimed to have seen something that no one was supposed to see during his lifetime. He communicated in a hushed tone about a covert organization that wielded a significant amount of influence, and their pursuit was unrelenting and never forgiving. Marcus claims that he sought sanctuary in the empty house as a last-ditch effort to prevent himself from falling into their grasp. The earnestness that he expressed in his voice was evident, despite the fact that his story appeared to be the stuff of conspiracy theories. At that moment, I came to the realization that Marcus required assistance, regardless of whether his pursuers were genuine or figments of his own mind. The notion that I make contact with someone, whether it be a friend or the authorities, was met with resistance from him. It is not. Your comprehension is lacking. Everywhere you look, they are waiting and watching. Insisting with a frenzied tone that was beginning to creep into his voice, "You are in danger now, as well." His warning caused a new wave of dread to wash over me, but I was unable to renounce my commitment to him. A compromise was what I suggested instead. I would bring him food and supplies, but in exchange, he would have to pledge that he would give serious consideration to seeking professional assistance. Despite the fact that I could tell he was not even close to being convinced that his pursuers were nothing more than phantoms of his own mind, he reluctantly accepted. I remained true to my commitment throughout the subsequent weeks. My regular visits turned into a peculiar habit due to the fact that each conversation I had with Marcus revealed more about his fragmented world. However, as time went on, a concept that was troubling began to take hold. However, what if his fears turned out to be accurate? A question that remained, casting an unwanted shade on our secret gatherings, continued to arise. All of a sudden one evening, everything was different. Upon getting closer to the house, I noticed that the silence was more oppressive than it had been previously. The door, which had been slightly ajar, was now securely shut, and there was a coolness in the air that was not familiar to me. The interior of the house was completely enveloped in darkness, and Marcus was nowhere to be found. My calls for him went unanswered, and the only thing that was visible in each room was the remaining remnants of his stay. A hastily written note was discovered by me in the location where Marcus had spent his evenings before to my arrival. "No, I'm sorry. They discovered me. I beg you to forget that we ever met. In this manner, you will be protected." The message, which was so resolute in its conclusion, left me in a state of disbelief. A flurry of inquiries rushed through my head. Where had he been located? Was he in danger? At the same time, however, was it true that his anxieties were based on reality? A great deal of stress persisted throughout the days that followed. It appeared as though every shadow was ominous, and every sound was a warning of impending doom. As a persistent reminder of the mystery that had been unfolding within its walls, the empty house next door served as a continuous reminder. And of Marcus, the destiny of whom continues to be a mystery. Story 4. The idea of going on a day hike in a distant place looked like the ideal way to get away from the rush and bustle of everyday life. It was claimed that the trail, which was famous for its breathtaking vistas and unspoiled natural beauty, would provide a day filled with both excitement and peace. I felt ready for the day ahead because I had a completely charged phone and a backpack that was stuffed with necessities. I also had a fully charged phone in case of an emergency. There was a brilliant blue sky above, and there was a soft breeze that carried the fresh aroma of pine and earth. The weather was exactly what we needed. Wonderful things began to happen during the hike. In addition to being well marked, the path was accompanied by spectacular views. The path was framed by towering trees, the leaves of which were swaying in the wind and sounding like they were whispering secrets. A few birds might be heard singing from their concealed perches, and the occasional stir in the underbrush provided a suggestion that there was fauna that was not visible. I was so taken aback by the natural splendor that surrounded me that I failed to recognize that I had strayed from the path that had been defined until it was, unfortunately, too late. First, I didn't feel an excessive amount of concern. In addition to having a respectable sense of direction, I had faith in my ability to find my way back. On the other hand, as I continued to explore in what I thought was the direction of the trail, the landscape became somewhat foreign to me. The sounds of the forest became alarmingly quiet. The trees appeared to have become denser, and the undergrowth appears to have become thicker. When it finally dawned on me that I was completely disoriented, I felt a sinking sensation fill my stomach. During the time that I was checking my phone, I discovered that it was dead, which caused my calm to begin to deteriorate. With the sun started its drop into the horizon, the seriousness of my situation became painfully evident. The one lifeline that I had relied on was useless, and the situation grew much more dire. It was getting dark, and I was trapped in the middle of a wilderness that was so isolated that there was no way to get aid when I needed it. The forest, which had been a source of amazement and beauty in the past, took on a dangerous and harsh air lately. My heart has been racing ever since I heard the rustle of the underbrush. Each and every shadow is a possible opponent. As the light began to fade, it projected bizarre shapes among the trees that were constantly shifting, and my imagination conjured up pictures of predators hiding just out of sight, watching and waiting. I made an effort to maintain my rationality and make use of the limited amount of light that was still available to me in order to find my path. In the hope that they would bring me back to the path, I followed what I believed to be animal paths. However, each attempt I made simply took me further into the forest. Over time, the light became even less bright, and the forest was quickly enveloped in an impenetrable blackness that engulfed all that was in my immediate vicinity. When you are by yourself and stranded in the bush, the nighttime presents you with a symphony of sounds, each one more horrifying than the one before it. In this vast and dark environment, every sound serves as a reminder of my vulnerability. The hoots of owls, the rustling of leaves, and the cry of a coyote in the distance are all examples of it. I discovered a location that was quite clear and made the decision to remain there. I was hoping that by remaining where I was, I would enhance the likelihood that I would be discovered. As the temperature dropped, the chill began to sink into my bones, and I became more and more hunched in my jacket in an effort to keep myself warm. The hours continued to pass, and each minute seemed like an eternity, filled with uncertainty and remorse. The trail was something that I should have paid more attention to. How come I hadn't checked to see if my phone was completely charged? I was on the verge of being overcome by hopelessness when I suddenly saw a glimmer of light that cut through the darkness. At first I believed that it was a trick of my tired mind, or that it was just my imagination. The more it grew brighter, however, I became aware that it was real. When I called out, my voice was hoarse with dread and relief, yet hope flooded through me at the same time. When my friends realized that I had not returned, they informed the search and rescue team, which was the owner of the light device. The sense of relief that I felt was overwhelming as they took me back to safety. The nightmare had finally broken. Nevertheless, the event left a mark on me that will not be erased. As soon as I was back in the comfort of my own house, the gravity of what had transpired started to really take hold of me. I had been shown the other side of the woods, which was one of danger and indifference, despite the fact that it was so attractive during the day. Having entered the realm of nature without adequate preparation and with an excessive amount of self-assurance, I had paid the price for my carelessness. The hike that ended up being unsuccessful served as a bitter lesson in the significance of being prepared and exercising prudence, as well as in respecting the natural world. This served as a timely reminder that the wilderness, despite its breathtaking beauty, does not care about the destinies of people who venture through its paths. I was fortunate enough to have been located. However, the memory of that night when I was alone and terrified in the depths of the forest will remain with me for the rest of my life. Being reminded of our place in the natural world is a humbling experience. Having grown accustomed to the symphony of urban life, I had become accustomed to living alone in a modest apartment on the ground floor that was nestled at the edge of a bustling city suburb. The constant hum of traffic, the occasional laughter of passers-by, and even the fleeting glances into my somewhat exposed living space were all a part of my daily existence. Although I place a high importance on privacy, I felt as though I had given up a luxury in exchange for the convenience of city living. My tolerance for these relatively modest intrusions, on the other hand, was put to the test when an unsettling pattern evolved, which turned my safe haven of isolation into a stage for an observer who was not visible to me. As the sun descended below the horizon, painting the sky in various tones of orange and purple, it was a beautiful autumn evening when it all started all over again. While I was savouring the warmth of a lamp that was faintly illuminated, I was cuddled up on my sofa with a book in my hand. Suddenly, my peripheral gaze was drawn to a movement at the window, which disrupted the peace and quiet that had been there in the moment. My eyes collided with a human face that was looking intently into my apartment. I had anticipated seeing a bird or even a stray cat when I looked up, but instead I saw a very human face. Despite the fact that the reflection of the interior light against the glass partially concealed the face, it was unable to identify any distinguishing characteristics of the individual. Not only was its appearance unexpected, but it also defied explanation. I was able to approach my flat, but it was slightly recessed from the sidewalk and enclosed by a little hedge, which prevented others from looking at it in a casual manner. In spite of everything, there it was, a face, staring at me without blinking from the blackness that was beyond. I got up from my seat and made my way to the window, determined to confront the voyeur. I was filled with a mixture of fury and confidence as I reached the window. However, when I got closer, the visage disappeared, leaving no indication of its presence behind, with the exception of the lingering impression that I was being watched. When I threw the window open and looked out into the darkness, I did not discover anything. The street was completely empty, with the exception of the occasional car that drove past. I was so shaken that I thought the encounter was a trick of the light, or maybe it was a pedestrian who was more curious than proper in their behavior. On the other hand, it turned out that the face at the window was not an isolated incident. My apartment was wrapped in darkness night after night, and the visitor kept coming back. Every incident was just as perplexing as the one before it. It didn't matter how swiftly I reacted or how diligently I sought. All I could find was the sound of my own heart beating and the sound of the empty street. A prisoner in my own home, I felt exposed and vulnerable as a result of the continual surveillance that was being conducted. Having made up my mind to solve the riddle, I took the necessary steps to record the breaking and entering. I placed a camera such that it was facing the window in the hopes of capturing evidence of the unexpected visitor that I had. Over the course of several nights, the face continued to make its appearance. It was always on the periphery of the evening, and it always vanished before I could get more than a glimpse of it. However, the camera did not record anything. My eyes were the only ones that could see the figure as if it were a ghost. One evening, in a fit of desperation and wrath, I made the decision to wait by the window, hidden from view. This was the moment when the issue became even more problematic. After a number of hours had passed, the face materialized just as I was about to give up hope of recovering. When I confronted it this time, I did not hurry into it. The face appeared to be looking for me within the poorly lit room, and I watched it with my breath caught in my throat as it appeared to continue its search. After then, I had a sudden flash of insight when the streetlight illuminated the characteristics of the person I was observing. The expression on the face was one of great melancholy and yearning, and it was a face that was both recognizable and completely unfamiliar. I felt shivers run down my spine as the eyes, which were not malicious in any way, stared at me with such intensity that I felt them. It was almost as if the visitor was gazing through me rather than simply at me, as if they were looking for something that had been misplaced or possibly never found. Before I had a chance to comprehend the information, the face vanished into the darkness, leaving me with more questions than answers. What exactly was this apparition that stalked me through the night? Why did they continue to come to my window night after night with such a dogged determination? As the nights that followed brought no further appearances, a portion of me started to question whether or not the events that I had experienced were indeed true. Is it possible that the solitary setting of living by myself has caused me to develop hallucinations and paranoia? I allowed this to occupy my thoughts until one morning when a chance meeting gave me with a piece of the puzzle that I had been unable to solve. There was a conversation going on between two old people who lived in the neighborhood, and I happened to catch it while I was at a local cafe. During their conversation, they discussed a tragedy that had taken place many years ago in the identical building where I currently reside. The final minutes of a young woman's life were spent looking out of a window on the ground level, waiting for a reunion that would never come to pass. She had committed suicide because she was so overcome with grief over a love that she had lost. The tale gave me a shiver all the way through. At that moment, I came to the realization that the face at my window was hers, and that it was connected to the location of her final vigil by the threads of her agony. This understanding was both alarming and incredibly sad. It served as a reminder of the grief that continues to linger in the locations that we occupy. When I think back on those odd experiences, I can't help but feel a connection to the woman who stared through my window. I can't help but feel some sort of connection to her. An expression of need could be seen in her eyes. It was a yearning for comprehension, for recognition of her presence and her suffering. By recognizing her, I may have provided her with some measure of the tranquility that she was looking for. I no longer receive visits from the face at the window, but the recollection of those eerie interactions continues to have an effect on me. The fabric of my everyday life has the spectral mark of her. This serves as a reminder of the unseen currents that flow beneath the surface of our existence, connecting us in ways that we may never fully comprehend. Story 5. When it was eventually time for me to clock out of my shift, the darkness had already cast its shadowy cloak over the town. Considering that it was a Tuesday, the diner was unusually crowded, and as a result, I was exhausted and eager to get home. When I drove by, the only indications of life were the occasional flare of headlights in the distance or the flicker of a street lamp. The roadways were almost completely devoid of pedestrians and vehicles. My desire to shorten the length of my travel prompted me to take a detour away from the main route. I was led by a narrow trail that I had never seen before till now. On the map, it indicated that there was a more expedient path, which would take us through the peaceful countryside that's surrounding our town. My route was obscured by the thick forest that surrounded the road, and the branches of the trees formed a canopy above me, making the darkness much more intense. While I was making my way up the curving road, I started to feel a growing sensation of unease within me. When I turned on the radio, the usual comfort of the radio's chatter morphed into a distant echo riddled with static. It seemed as if the signal was unable to penetrate the dense vegetation that surrounded me. My vehicle came to a complete and total halt at a crossroads, and the engine went completely silent, as if it had suddenly lost the desire to go. This occurred without any prior notice. There was no success in bringing it back to life. It was as lifeless as the night air where I was standing. There were no bars on my phone, which is my primary means of communication with the outside world. A state of complete and utter seclusion. When I was in the driver's seat, I considered the various choices I had. Despite the fact that my intuition hinted that I would be in for a really long night, the choice that made the most sense was to wait for a car to pass by. I was surrounded by the suffocating silence of the countryside, which was a striking contrast to the incessant hum of the diner's kitchen, which I had been accustomed to. There was a palpable sensation of vulnerability that began to creep in as the minutes grew into hours. It appeared as though the darkness was pressing against the windows, a force that was real and was fueled by the unknown. My heart was pounding with excitement at every rustle in the underbrush and every snap of a twig. Fear colored these sounds as ominous signs, despite the fact that the reasoning half of my brain attempted to reject them as the sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business operations. I was unable to shake the sensation that I was being observed. inspected by eyes that might not have been visible from the shadowy corners of the forest. My presence seemed to have been seen by the night itself, which could be interpreted as either curious or possibly malicious. With the intention of diverting my attention, I concentrated on the intersection. In my memory, I recalled that crossroads were rich in tradition and legend. They were places where deals were made and destiny were altered. A shudder ran down my spine as I contemplated the ancient beliefs, which mingled with the feelings of anxiety that I was already experiencing. When I looked at it, I saw it. A dim light could be seen in the distance. It was not the artificial glow of the headlights of the vehicles, rather, it was a gentle, pulsating luminescence that appeared to float above the ground. This thing moved with intent, inching closer and closer to the intersection where my car and I were waiting in silence. Ethereal and inexplicable, the light that was quickly approaching held the promise of either redemption or catastrophe. My thoughts were racing with potential outcomes, each one more outlandish and terrifying than the one that came before it. Could it have been nothing more than a fellow traveler, a ray of light in my hopeless situation? Alternatively, something that is far older and more mysterious, and that is pulled to the intersection for reasons that I am unable to comprehend. I was pulled out of the protection of my automobile along with a mixture of anxiety and intrigue as the light continued its leisurely approach. Its smooth bobbing motion was fascinating, and it pulled me out of my car. I felt as like I was falling deeper into the unknown with each step that I took toward it, the brisk night air gently caressing against my skin, the way a whisper might. In proportion to the decreasing distance, the origin of the light became more discernible. In the hand of a man that was enveloped in darkness was a lamp that was already rather old and had seen better days. Despite the fact that the person's features were concealed and their figure blended into the darkness, the illumination of the lantern projected a strange aura around them. Is there a problem with the car? The voice that broke the silence was shockingly unremarkable, which was a striking contrast to the bizarre situation that I found myself in. Nevertheless, there was a tone hiding beneath the surface that I was unable to identify. It was something that caused the hairs on the back of my neck to rise up. Although my voice was struggling, I nodded. The path leading back to my vehicle was illuminated by the lamp as the figure moved closer to me. The only sound that could be heard was the crunch of gravel underfoot as we went back and forth. The silence that surrounded us was unsettling. When the person arrived at the vehicle, they placed a lantern on the hood of the vehicle. The light emanating from the lantern threw deep shadows across their face, exposing nothing. It was the familiarity with which they moved around the vehicle that made me feel uneasy. Eventually, after I had succeeded in opening the hood, they leaned their bodies under it. Over the course of the minutes, the silence became increasingly weighty, replete with questions that were not addressed and anxieties that were not voiced. Then, with a suddenness that caused me to start, the figure straightened up and the engine began to splutter to life as if it had never failed before. I turned around to express my gratitude, but instead, I found myself conversing with the night. It was just the lamp that was placed on the hood of my car that served as evidence that the person had ever been there. The figure had disappeared in the same strange manner that they had appeared. While I was driving away from the intersection, the lantern, which was now my companion in the passenger seat, I was experiencing a conflicting feeling of confusion and relief. The road appeared to be less menacing, and the shadows appeared to be less menacing. Nonetheless, the encounter presented me with more questions than it did answers. Which one was the enigmatic figure? Someone who watches over the intersection? A spectre from the dark past? Perhaps you are just a decent Samaritan. In the same way that their disappearance was mysterious, so was their timing. the reasonable explanations appeared to be empty, since they were unable to provide a complete explanation for the peculiarities that occurred during the night. Story 6. The attraction of the deserted has always maintained a particular interest for me even since I was a child. There is something about the unexpressed tales, the echoes of the past, that continue to linger in locations that have been forgotten by the world for a very long time. It was this fascination that brought me to the old institution on the outskirts of town, which is a relic of a bygone period of mental treatment and is now little more than a skeleton of what it used to be. As a result of years of neglect, the building stood alone in the middle of the desert. The passage of time had left its once grand facade with scars, including broken windows and walls that were covered in a tapestry of graffiti. There was a gradual process of nature reclaiming what mankind had left behind, and the surrounding grounds had become overgrown. Even though it was bright and sunny outside, I felt a chill run down my spine as I entered the asylum via the gaping maw of the main entrance. I felt as though the asylum was consuming me completely. Inside, the air was thick with dust and rotting, and the atmosphere was dense. It was as if the sun was streaming in through the broken windows, generating long shadows that stretched across the peeling paint and damaged floorboards. The only sounds that could be heard were the occasional drip of water and the crunch of rubble underfoot. The quiet was oppressive during this time. It seemed as though each step was a disturbance, an incursion into a space that had been reserved for the deceased and the memories that they held. I was driven deeper into the asylum by a macabre curiosity to see what lay beneath the surface, and I proceeded to explore farther. Rooms were left open and doors were left unfastened, exposing relics of its previous function. These included rusty bed frames, chairs that had been flipped over, and in one of the chiller rooms, the remains of leather shackles that were placed on a bed. Here, the atmosphere seemed thicker, as if it were packed with an unseen tension. It seemed as if the walls themselves recalled the anguish that they had seen. As I proceeded farther, the sensible part of my thinking took note of the architectural beauty that was still present. The high ceilings and the delicate details of the mouldings were a striking contrast to the use that the building had formerly served. In spite of this, a developing sense of anxiety rapidly eclipsed the admiration that was initially felt. At first, there were sounds that were inexplicable, considering that there was no breeze blowing within the building. Footsteps reverberated in the halls of the faraway building, always just out of sight, a sound that can be described as something dragging across the floor above. There were whispers that appeared to originate from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. I convinced myself that it was the building's natural sounds of disintegration, the settling of the edifice. Despite this, the sensation of being watched and of not being alone became more intense with each step that was taken. And then the shadows appeared. On multiple occasions, I was able to catch glimpses of various figures moving on the periphery of my field of view. After making a hasty turn, I discovered that the only thing I could see were vacant rooms and the play of light through broken windows. Logic was fighting against basic terror, and the need to leave was growing stronger with each passing instant. My heart was racing. It was in the basement that I finally gave up and gave in to my resolve. Here the air was somewhat cooler, and the darkness was nearly complete. The beam of my flashlight was able to penetrate the darkness and expose a lengthy corridor that was lined with doors. At the halfway point, there was a quick movement across the wall, which was a shadow that was darker than the darkness that was all around it. A visceral and emotional reaction, panic grabbed grip of the situation. When I turned around and started running, the sound of my footsteps reverberated in my ears, and I had the sensation that something was chasing after me and propelling me onward. Until I burst through the entryway into the light of day, gasping for air. I did not stop until I was completely out of breath. The sense of relief that came with escaping was laced with shame, due to the awareness that I had been foolish. There was more to the facility than merely a building that had been abandoned. It was a site where a great deal of sorrow and suffering occurred. It was only after I arrived that I was confronted with the depth of human suffering. I had entered in search of adventure. At that moment, as I stumbled away from its overwhelming presence, I pledged to myself that I would never go back. Story 7. It is impossible to deny the Pool of Paris, with its charming streets, breathtaking architecture, and extensive history. The appeal of the city was what lured me to the city for a trip that I had been saving up for over the course of many years. One of the numerous sites that stood out as a must-see was the catacombs, which are a maze of history that are located beneath the bustling streets of the city. The catacombs are where the bones of over 6 million individuals were found. My decision to go on a guided tour into the depths was motivated by a macabre interest on my part, which stood in stark contrast to the beauty that was above me. As our company made its way down the tiny stairway, the temperature of the air began to drop, and the sounds of the city gradually disappeared, to be replaced by a quiet that was so profound that it seemed to be a physical entity. Our tour guide, a man whose enthusiasm for the history of the catacombs shone through in his impassioned descriptions, guided us down the tunnels that were very weakly lit during our visit. The walls, which were covered with skulls and bones that were organized in an orderly fashion, revealed the story of a city that had found no more room for its dead. Because I was fascinated by the past, I lagged behind the group and focused my attention on the plaques that provided information about the formation of the catacombs. When I was experiencing one of these moments of distraction, I suddenly became aware that I had lost track of my group. The homogeneity of the tunnels caused me to get disoriented, which led to the onset of panic as I hurried forward in the hope of catching up. All of the corridors appeared to be identical, consisting of a never-ending loop of bones and damp stone. My eyes were tricked by the deep shadows that were formed by the dark lighting, which was intended to maintain the authenticity of the ambience and safeguard the remains. On multiple occasions, I was under the impression that I saw a figure standing in the distance. But when I looked back, I saw nothing but the empty route that lay ahead of me. The only sounds that could be heard were the sound of my footsteps and the occasional trickle of water in the distance, which created an uncanny rhythm that reverberated throughout the empty chambers. The quiet was oppressive across the entire space. After a few hours had passed, the original anxiety subsided into a fear that was more resigned. It was a living anomaly in a kingdom of the dead, and I was completely alone. I was surrounded by the ruins of centuries that had passed already. I had made the mistake of leaving my phone on the surface of my luggage, and it was of no assistance to me. The chill in the air penetrated my bones, serving as a continual reminder of the doom that was waiting for me in the event that I was unable to find a way out of the situation. When I spoke out for assistance, my voice sounded foreign in the enveloping silence. Nonetheless, the only response I received was the mocking echo of my own crying out for assistance. My flashlight, which was my only source of illumination, started to run out of battery power, which resulted in a pool of light that was gradually dwindling around me. Even though my legs were tired and my hunger was gnawing, I was motivated to proceed because I was thinking of being abandoned in the midst of the dead in full darkness. As I was experiencing a moment of hopelessness, I collapsed next to a wall of skulls, the empty sockets of which appeared to be watching me with a macabre curiosity. It was at that moment, when I was at the lowest point of my pessimism, that I became aware of a faint sound that was distinct from the constant drip of water. Do you hear footsteps? Incorrect. It was far too erratic. It was a scratching sound that was getting closer and closer with each passing instant. The sound of scraping became increasingly loud, and its erratic pattern sent waves of dread through my body. which was already fatigued beyond measure. My imagination conjured up pictures of skeletal people that had been pulled from their everlasting rest to roam the gloomy hallways. My body was jammed up against the wall as if the bones of the long dead could provide protection from whatever was coming my way. I was eventually able to see the source of the disturbance, which turned out to be a giant rat with matted fur and eyes that shone brightly in the weak light of my flashlight that was beginning to fade. I felt a wave of relief flood over me, and then I let out a hollow laugh at my own terrible fear. However, the existence of the rat indicated that there was something else. The paths that animals use are typically those that lead to exits. I made the decision to pursue the creature, maintaining a safe distance from it as it scurried along a trail that I had not observed previously. This decision was made with a fresh sense of purpose. As I followed my improbable guide, the tunnel started to undergo a transformation. The arrangements of bones on the walls were replaced by rough stone, and the walls did not have as much decoration. It was a clue that I was heading toward an exit, or at the very least, closer to the surface, because the air became more fresh. It appeared as though the rat was unaware of my presence as it continued its trek until it managed to escape through a small crack in the wall and vanish. As I stood there in front of the gap, I hesitated. For a human to be able to pass through, it was extremely narrow, just barely broad enough. However, it was the first indication of hope that I had come upon since I had become disoriented. As I inched forward, the rough stone scraped against my flesh as I forced myself into the aperture. I took a deep breath and pushed myself closer to the opening. There was a simultaneous conflict between the terror of becoming trapped and the fear of spending yet another instant lost in the catacombs. As soon as I emerged on the other side, I discovered that I was in a section of the catacombs that I had never visited before. This time the tunnels were more spacious, the air was more clear, and I was so far away that I believed I could make out the tiniest glimmer of light. I was drawn to the promise of escape that the light gave, and despite the fact that my flashlight had expired, I staggered ahead. As the light intensified, it revealed the dead end that was stopped by a gate that had corroded. Despite the fact that it was locked, I was able to see the night sky through the bars, with the stars shining brightly in the clear sky. My eyes welled up with tears as I took in the sight of the outside world, which was so close, but still inaccessible. In a fit of rage, I shook the gate, and the sound reverberated loudly throughout the otherwise silent tunnel. Suddenly, I was astonished to hear voices coming from the opposite side. I yelled out for assistance and repeatedly pounded on the gate with all of my strength. After a brief pause, a beam of light from a flashlight was eventually able to penetrate the darkness, and it was followed by the appearance of 2 law enforcement personnel. Story 8. I felt a palpable presence that threatened to overpower me, and it was panic that was clawing at my chest. I took a brief second to consider all of my choices. In spite of the fact that confronting the figures appeared to be a risky bet, it was impossible for me to let them follow me home. I was able to make the decision for myself as they accelerated their pace, which resulted in the distance between us swiftly decreasing. The rush of adrenaline caused me to run. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears as the sound of our footsteps turned into a chaotic symphony in the streets that were without people. did it with every last bit of strength I had, and I smashed through the door. When compared to the darkness of the night, the unexpected brightness and noise produced a striking contrast. I was gasping for air and casting anxious glances over my shoulder as I stumbled into the establishment, and the few customers who were inside turned to gaze at me. A dark silhouette that appeared to absorb the glow rather than reflect it had stopped just beyond the reach of the diner's light. The figure had stopped just beyond the diner's light. A fleeting instant of eye contact occurred between us before they turned away and disappeared into the darkness. As I nervously approached the counter, I noticed that the waitress's expression of concern was a reflection of my own anxiety. I was able to stutter out a plea for the police while maintaining my focus on the door. All the while, I was half expecting the figure to make another appearance. The authorities arrived in a short amount of time, but they were unable to do much to help. In addition, the person had not been observed by anyone else, and a search of the area yielded no results. A ride home was offered to me, and they suggested that I obtain a restraining order against the person if they could be identified. Additionally, they advised me to remain safe. It was as if a heavy cloak had settled over me, leaving me feeling exposed and defenseless. The reality of my predicament had settled in. After that, the days that followed were a haze of anxiety and paranoia. The night was something I loathed. Shadows made me jump, and I flinched every time I got a phone call. Having moved to the city, I had experienced a sense of freedom that was now a distant memory. It had been replaced by a prison that I had created for myself, which was bound by dread and the unknown. I began to take measures because I was adamant that I would not let this unseen dread to make decisions about my life. I altered my schedule, changed my phone number, and even enrolled in classes to learn how to defend myself legally. Despite the fact that these efforts were rather minor, they were significant because they allowed me to retake control in a circumstance in which I had previously felt completely helpless. The sensation of being watched never went away entirely, despite the fact that I gave it my best effort. The stalker continued to be a shadowy presence in my life. It was like a ghostly person that appeared and vanished, leaving behind nothing but the anxiety that left in their wake. Following the passage of several months, the occurrences became less frequent. Calls on the phone came to an end. My stalker had either lost interest in me or gone on, and I started to hope that this was the case. However, the harm had already been done. The city, which had been a site of hope in the past, now possessed a menacing edge, serving as a warning that danger might conceal itself in the most ordinary of situations. As I sit here and write this, perusing the city lights from the window of my flat, I find myself wondering if I will ever again experience a sense of genuine safety. The event has left an indelible mark on me, a scar that acts as a continual reminder of the precarious nature of our existence and the invisible dangers that have the potential to destroy it in an instant. One of my single winter camping adventures began with magnificent snowscapes that stretched as far as the eye could see, all the way to the horizon. This was precisely what I had thought it would be like. Only the sound of my boots crunching on the ground and the occasional chirp of a bird in the distance were the only sounds that broke the tranquility of the forest. In spite of the chilly weather, I had spent months getting ready for this, reading every book and inspecting my equipment twice or even 3 times. It was important to me to demonstrate to myself that I was capable of overcoming the challenges that nature presented to me on my own merits. When I finally got around to setting up camp, the sun had already begun to set, and it was creating an orange glow over the snow above me. A high-quality shelter that could be used in all 4 seasons, my tent guaranteed both warmth and protection from the weather. Keeping my spirits up and my self-assurance unshaken, I prepared a straightforward lunch. My sense of safety, however, diminished as the night progressed. Yes, the prediction had mentioned that there would be a snowstorm, but nothing could have adequately prepared me for the brutality with which it approached. The wind howled like a band of wolves, and each gust of wind threatened to rip my tent away from its moorings. Snow swiftly accumulated, covering the environment and transforming my tent, which had been a picture-perfect location, into a prison of white. However, the storm continued to rage unabated throughout the night, despite my best efforts to cling to the idea that it would pass and that the morning would bring peace. I was unable to go asleep because the constant noise and the biting cold that appeared to penetrate every layer of my clothing prevented me from falling asleep. Sleep was a distant dream. By the second day, I was fighting a battle against my own waning spirits. My attempts to leave the tent were met with a wall of white, which was dazzling and disorienting due to the blizzard we were experiencing. There was no landmark left standing. It seemed like every way was the same. As soon as I understood that I was confined, panic hit me. My tracks from the previous day were removed as if I had never created them in the first place. The storm was making fun of me, testing my determination and my readiness to deal with it. Now, the food supplies that were supposed to last for a week appeared to be absurdly insufficient. Each meal was smaller than the one before it because I rationed them out. Due to the fact that my stove was struggling to keep up with the cold, I stored my fuel like a miser, out of worry that it would run out at any time. Even after 3 days, there was no indication that the storm would abate. It seemed as though the rest of the world had forgotten about my existence and I was like a speck in a sea of white snow. My sense of loneliness became a palpable burden as it pressed down on me. A one-sided discussion with loved ones that I worried I might never see again was caught on my phone while I was using it to record texts. At that moment, when I was at my lowest point, I became aware of a faint sound that was distinct from the whistling winds and the changing snow as it passed by. In the beginning, I believed that it was a hallucination that was brought on by my tense nerves, which were caused by being alone. However, it continued to exist. A tapping that is rhythmic, intended to be, being unyielding. As I contemplated my choices, I was filled with a mixture of terror and curiosity. Was it a rescue operation? Was it something that was much more harmful, drawn to the fragile state that I was under? In the midst of the raging storm, the tapping continued, acting as a metronome that compelled me to take corrective action. In preparation for the chill that lay beyond the relative warmth of my tent, I wrapped myself in layers of clothing and fortified myself. The howl of the wind greeted me like an old foe as I unzipped the entryway, and my fingers shook as I did so. It was almost impossible to see anything outside, a blank canvas on which my anxieties painted monster shadows. The landscape had been converted into a featureless expanse as a result of the snowstorm. As the tapping became louder and more forceful, it ultimately directed me. Every step I took was an act of faith, and I lowered my head in defiance of the blizzard's ferocity as I made my way through the snow. I located the source not too far away from where I was sleeping, which was a tree with snow-covered branches, and there, perched on a lower branch, was a crow, making a rhythmic tapping sound with its beak against the wood. It was black against the white background. My anxieties were suddenly forgotten as I paused, because the sight was so unexpected and so out of place in the desolate setting. It appeared as though the crow was unaffected by my presence, as it seemed to continue tapping. It seemed as though the bird was trying to convey a message in a world that was being hushed by the storm, an appeal to persevere. I went back to my refuge having become more resolute, and my spirit had been slightly raised by the experience. As if for the temporary truth to be respected, the storm started to lessen in intensity. On the morning of day 4, the world emerged from beneath the blanket of snow, seeming battered yet beautiful in the light of dawn. I went out into the world with the intention of regaining my bearings and determining a way to return to civilization. As I made my way forward, I noticed that the scenery had changed beyond recognition. Landmarks that I had counted on were no longer there. Instead, undulating drifts of snow were in their place. The recollection of the crow's tenacity, on the other hand, served as a guiding light of optimism in the midst of the wide void. As the sun rose higher in the sky, its rays started to melt the boundaries of my prison, which was made of ice. Around noon, I became aware of the sound of a snowmobile in the distance. It appeared that salvation was on the horizon. When I failed to check in, the search party that was dispatched to my location discovered me half frozen but still alive. It is finally over with me.